While last night's debate might well have signaled the death of Trump's presidential chances, it also could have possibly been the birth of his next step, because while many of you were watching the debate commentary here on the Young Turks or on another source of media, perhaps watching it directly on Fox News, there was one other news source where you could have watched it, and that was #TrumpTV. Let's bring up this screenshot. And you'll see them blasting out, if you're tired of biased mainstream media reporting, otherwise known as Crooked Hillary's super PAC, but I don't know what that means. Tune into my Facebook Live broadcasts, #DrainTheSwamp, which, by the way, has taken over his supporters. They love that expression. And so there, they have set up in advance, they did a pre-show, they did a post-show with live commentary on what they were literally calling, if you bring up the second one, you'll see #TrumpTV. So we're not messing around anymore. This isn't just speculation. Supposedly upwards of 8 million people total at some point tuned into Trump TV's coverage of the debate, which is significant numbers.
Or 6 guys tuned in 1.2 million times.
But that's a good math right there, yeah.
Yeah, well, it may not be right. I just threw it out
think it's a low ball, but
yeah,
it's close, yes.
So, look, everybody's saying this guy might go into the media. It's very hard to get cable licensing all across the country. He should do what the Young Turks do. He should go online. Wait a minute, why am I giving this guy advice?
Don't give him advice, but you're 100% right.
Yeah.
Well, let's return to that in just a second. I want to give people a little bit of an idea of what went on, because maybe some people are like, oh, I don't want to hear it from the mainstream media. Maybe I too should tune into Trump TV. And so the campaign-sanctioned broadcast included appearances by Trump's children, campaign manager Kellyanne Conway, and advisors like retired General Michael Flynn. So if you'd like to just purely see people from his campaign, there is a place where you can do that. And here are some quotes from the coverage to give you an idea of the critical, nuanced look at Donald Trump's performance that you can expect from Trump TV. This is a great thing, Boris, because we've talked many times kind of behind the scenes about the frustration with the media coverage. You can come here and hear it straight from us, which, by the way, I think summarizes better than anything else. One of the big problems with the internet is that while there's been a proliferation of news sources across the political spectrum, one of the bad things is that more and more people are exclusively getting news from people that they agree with, from a slant that they agree with, and not having their views and preconceptions challenged. They're basically saying that that's what they will do there, which is unfortunate. I think that more people need to get their news from more diverse sources.
And who's Boris? I mean, that's what
I don't know who either of those guys
are.
I've
been skeptical about this whole Russia thing, but wait a minute, Boris?
Boris.
What is this, Rocky and Bull? Boris and Natasha?
It was both live coverage and there were some cartoon characters. Let's see. Cliff Sims goes on to say all 6 of the 15-minute segments, total home runs for him. I think this was really the performance that Donald Trump needed to grab that momentum going toward the election. You go point by point, he knocked it out of the park, which I'm sure is very helpful for a candidate. Look, you have to be critical. Like, whether you like Trump or you like Hillary Clinton, both of them had missteps. Both of them had evasions, places where they could have done better. What good is there in refusing to accept a reality on those points?
Well, first of all, I want to say that one of the problems with a guy like Donald Trump is that he's always, from birth, had so much money that there's nobody around him. He's one of those guys who clearly surrounds himself with yes men and yes women who will just,
yes,
wonderful
Boris's.
Donald. Yeah, Moose and Squirrel have escaped. They won't tell him when Moose and Squirrel escaped.
So he'll never know.
He'll never know. So that's why, look, he got where he is, which is the Republican nominee, by being who he is. But then when it was time to change, look, people were afraid to tell him, and if they told him, he didn't listen.
Or he fired them.
I actually thought he tried to be different last night. Instead of scowling, he was just kind of narrowing his eyes into little slits, and instead of exploding, he was keeping himself together. But it's so easy to bait him.
It is easy.
Hillary just had no trouble baiting him.
Yeah, I think that he showed, to the extent that he can control his emotions, he did early on especially, but her strategy was just poke him and poke him and poke the bear. And the bear will eventually react, and we did see that. And I mean, I guess from the point of view of one of his supporters, he made some good points, and that deserves to be spread. And certainly there are a couple of issues where he's willing to challenge the sort of the status quo, like there was his ethics reform platform that he put forward a couple of days ago, which I don't trust him on, but at least he's putting something new out there. But also, to your point about getting the cable licenses, so you need the carriage deals, basically. You can't just start up a cable channel and then all of a sudden you're on cable. There's only so much room on cable. That's one of the reasons that Current TV ended up selling their position on cable to Al Jazeera. And so I don't know that he can necessarily do that. I think it's much more likely that he'll set up something like Sarah TV or The Blaze or something like that. And I'm curious, from your point of view, so you're engaged in this online enterprise. Do you see it lasting? Do you see it catching on? Is this going to some extent maim Fox News and The Blaze and InfoWars and all that?
Well, it's interesting because I was talking to Ryan Grimm from the Huffington Post today. Fox News is trying to reposition itself as not the right-wing thing anymore, but as like actual kind of news outlet, which would be a radical transformation for them. And I think the big question is, to me, that nobody's talking about is Trump has been really close with Alex Jones.
Yeah.
And if he gets Alex Jones in on his venture, I mean, that guy's got, as you know, a huge, I mean, maybe obnoxious, you guys mix it up with him a little while back, but he's got a huge reach. And if Trump and Alex Jones got together, I think that could have real power. Otherwise, honestly, I think people are starting to get sick of this guy. I think even his base, I mean, I saw an article that there's not the kind of turnout as rallies there were.
Yeah.
His thing is like two-dimensional. It's like, at least Alex Jones comes up with crazy new conspiracy theories every week.
His is the same conspiracy
Yeah, everybody's getting, I mean, my hatred of Trump is being replaced by I'm just tired of the guy.
Yeah.
And I think his fans are beginning to feel the same way. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, but I think related to that also is that the mystique that he built up for himself, the aura was, I'm a winner. But you notice he's not tweeting out a lot of polls these days, and even his supporters can only deny the results of those polls for so long. And look, you may want to go to the rally of a guy who's going to be president, but the rally of a guy who's going to lose in 3 weeks, do you really want that? Maybe not so much. But yeah, I agree. I think that there's definitely room for him to try to court some of those Alex Jones viewers. I mean, I don't know that there's more than, I mean, there's not too many, but there's enough. And sometimes they forget how to leave the room that they're in, and so they're stuck there watching a lot of videos, and they want to see stuff about lizard men controlling the government and how about every school shooting ever has been faked and how we've never been to the moon or Antarctica or whatever the hell the theory is for the day.
And if you weren't being pacified by the chemtrails, you'd know that all of that is true.
I know. Well, I'm busy with the fact that I drank out of a plastic bottle, and so now I'm gay, and so that is now my life.
I didn't realize that was a thing.
Yeah. Well, also, Trump is definitely in it for the money. And you might say, well, if he's not going to be on cable, how's he going to make big money? But if he starts up an online network and he grabs on to Alex Jones's advertisers, he can sell disaster vests and end-of-the-world seeds and all sort of stuff for people who think that the world's about to... It's going to be great money for him. Huge. Maybe you can invest in gold or something like that. Anyway, look, it's going to be nonsense, and I think that no one who goes there is going to have their life enriched, and it's too bad because there are some people.
You don't think?
I'm joking, but I'm also being serious because
no,
there are
I'm
people
laughing
who
just
support
with
him.
your choice of words,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is very good. But
there are people out there who support Donald Trump who, unfortunately, are probably more likely to be racists and sexist and Islamophobes and stuff like that. But they have been left behind by the economic agenda of both the major parties. And I want them to be educated about that and then act in a rational way, that in the way that politicians have left them behind. But if they just turned to nonstop conspiracy theories, we're never going to have that.
And actually, it's a great point, and it's worth pointing out that the left loves to look down on Trump supporters. But the fact is, where has the left been? And I do it too. But and sure, there are some bad hombres there for sure. But the fact is, we haven't told those people a story that says, this is what's wrong with your world. This is why things look bad for you. It's not the Muslims. It's not the Latinos. It's the goddamn corporations. It's the people who are robbing you blind. It's the people like Donald Trump. It's, we haven't told that story. So along come the conspiracy theory people in the right wing to say it's A, B, and C. And they go, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
We got to tell them a story that makes sense. So the next time a Democrat starts sneering at a Trump supporter, I'm going to want to say, what are you doing to talk to those people? What's your story for those people?
No, that's a great point. And I think that we need to make clear to them that they have this suspicion of government, and they're almost there, but they are being screwed over by people like Donald Trump and people like Hillary Clinton. Not equally, but both. And the only way to disarm both of those sides at the same time is to get money out of politics, to stop Donald Trump and people like him from being able to buy politicians, and people like Hillary Clinton to craft their policies based on the people who have bought them. And I think that that's something that both liberals and conservatives can get behind.
Well, that's your public position. Afterwards, we'll get some donors in and find out your
My private
position.
position is
Yeah.
pro-fracking.
Right.
There's so much you get with Young Turks membership. You get the full 2-hour show of the Young Turks every single day. It's commercial free. You get Aggressive Progressives. You get all the other network shows that we put together. What else? Post games, right? And other things. And hugs and kisses and rainbows. You know what?
Somebody go get a six-pack.
And let's all enjoy membership together. tytnetwork.com/join.